The idea of contemporary art entails, as a presupposition, the existence of an idea of the contemporary. That is to say, the structure of temporality, in this case, is to be comprehended as the way time is understood or conceptualized and then lived out in society, as opposed to some notion of time that is natural or objective, right? You live out the implications of your situation. So the contemporary is therefore both an idea of the time in which we are in and a goal of reacting more effectively to the demands of the immediate present. What then is contemporary art in Singapore, and how does it relate to the socio-political context within which it functions, one in which culture as a notion from the 1980s becomes more prominent? So this is the central focus of what I'm trying to do. Contemporary art therefore draws also, I think, of what can be called an alternative or perhaps suppressed tradition of modernism, as seen in the legacy of Surrealism, the Dada movement, and Marcel Duchamp, 1887 to 1968. So in fact, what happens is that the principles of autonomous art were contested in the name of connecting art with life. This suppressed tradition of modernism did that, though searchingly interpreted for the needs of the local in terms of content and cultural orientation. In Singapore, the state followed with the articulation of its own creative policy in the 2000 Renaissance City report, which reinforced the position of the 1992 Singapore Global City for the Arts report. And in 2016, the NAC website still says its mission is, quote, to develop Singapore as a distinctive global city for the arts. So the key moment comes, I think, really, when all this comes to a head, in the late 1980s, with the publication of the 1989 report of the Advisory Council on Culture and the Arts. So, as it were, the 1980s, through the change in cultural thinking, meant that Singapore was entering the present. It no longer had to quite catch up in the same way that it had to the 1960s, when something called modernization theory was dominant in development thinking in the US, for instance. This is an actual American term. So what had happened is that, and in fact the 1960s was called the decade of development by the United Nations. Singapore is in the interesting position of having artistic margins with avant-garde inclinations that presumably wanted to question artistic authority and conventions ahead of the authoritative arts institutional centers that could sanction and canonize art. I want to suggest that this is not the only cause, but it's at least partially a cause for the emergence of contemporary arts turned modernization. And this has something to do with contemporary art's arrival in Singapore. In Singapore and around the region, medium-specific and object-based art are reincorporated as component parts of an expansive artistic practice. And therefore, Singapore actually went beyond the sort of purist notion of conceptualism, where you can get rid of painting and all that and just do other versions of art using what you can see these days, installations, sculpture, that sort of thing, towards expanded practice that, in particular, performance art and installation sculpture are blended with coexisting painting and drawing. Thus, traditional painting does not disappear, as it should have in these Western theorizations of art, but they are blended and they allow a certain engagement with the fractured life of Singapore itself that stern modernization created. These matters form the thematic core of an exhibition in 1990 entitled Urban Artists, 25 Years of Singapore Art, initiated by the then director of the National Museum, Kwa Chong Guan, and curated by Suzy Quay. And why is this exhibition important? Because it's valuable, I think, as an authentic representative voice from the end of the 1980s that captures the artistic transitions in both aesthetic, media, and content. That is to say, it shows in different ways the older modern art engagement with modernization and the newer art engagement modernization that slowly comes to prominence in the 1980s. And it therefore shows what is transitioning from modern to contemporary art. The proposal was for a work measuring 5 feet by 5 feet to be drawn partially on the wall and partially on the floor of the exhibition hall. It only brought up the question of art's materiality, but also questioned how the Singapore River might be reconceived, given both its importance in Singapore's history as entrepot and its cliched appearance in nostalgic and touristic visual renditions of Singapore. He also painted a 100-meter-long painting that unpredictably is called The Lonely Road. He offered to cut up into smaller and more affordable sizes. Even more unpredictably, art historian T.K. Sabapati tells us, was the incineration of his three-dimensional art constructions at dusk. Tan embarked upon an action which completely undermined the existence of a work as an object. As a phenomenon, it is singular in Tan's artistic career and unique in the history of art in Singapore. Tan delivers a quiet critique of urbanization's degrading environmental impact with no reconciliation offered between the value of the red earth and the urbanization that has exposed it to erosion. The result is, I think, an artwork in which the historical presence of fracture and fragments is privileged, and this presentism is not vitiated by the philosophical studies undergirding the circular shapes used in it. That is to say, the Chinese cultural texts are not marshaled as they might be to valorize a timeless realm. Therefore, the question is asked, what happens now? What is the role of art now at the point when the institutions of art are so huge and the Singapore Biennale is now part of a regional circuit of biennales in which you can start off with Australia at the Asia-Pacific Triennial and go around and come down to Singapore. The moment of art, I think, in this moment is this moment of the creative industries, of creative thinking, of social media, of intensity by which culture and capitalism are so imbricated in a way that makes the 1980s look sort of quaint. I'm not inclined to say that the moment is some terribly super negative moment. The artistic scene with increased art education is now perhaps more like art anywhere else in the world where people are taught art at art school. The moment is sort of mixed, right? I don't think of it as a supremely negative thing. It does bring other, from certain points of view, negative aspects, but maybe that's just to be expected. You can't have everything.
I think historically we have been, the state has a very strong hand in the development of Singapore. So Singapore went from third world to first within like 3 decades, right? So, you know, which in the West, they will talk about 200 years. So with everything, in such a short period of time, development needs to be quick. I would urge all Singaporeans here to just be appreciative of what the cultural environment that we have and the facilities that we have. And this is definitely, at this point in time, is definitely different from the West, where funding has been cut and the cultural institutions and infrastructure might be crumbling. But here, there's so much pumping of money into facilities and hardware or software. And even this program today, I mean, that's part of the efforts by institutions and government agencies to make sure that we are more cultured and we are more vibrant. And indeed, we are more vibrant.